Charles Redding, now 95 years old, was confined to a solitary routine in his aging home. The house, on the outside, already showed signs of neglect. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the garden, once well maintained by his late wife, was overrun with weeds. But the true state of Charles was not just in the exterior of the house, but in the invisible marks left by decades of painful memories and loneliness. Inside the house was a journey through time. Faded photographs covered the walls, static reminders of a life full of stories, smiles, and moments that now seemed distant, almost as if they belonged to someone else. One photo in particular always caught the eye. Charles, younger, holding his newborn son, Stephen. In Charles's eyes in that photo there was hope, a glimmer that time and distance had slowly erased. Stephen, his son, had left years ago, leaving a void hard to fill. Charles had expectations for Stephen's future, hoping he would lead a full life, but he never imagined it would mean his permanent absence. With each passing year, Charles felt more isolated, his life shrinking around the walls of that house. His physical health was deteriorating, but the hardest weight to bear was the emotional burden of abandonment. It was in this context that Jack Morgan reappeared in Charles's life. A longtime friend and war veteran, Jack was a man living with his own scars, some visible, others hidden deep within his soul. Although they didn't see each other often, Jack always considered Charles like a brother, a bond forged by time, shared experiences, and mutual respect. When Jack heard that Charles was living alone and facing difficulties, he decided to visit him. It was a long overdue meeting, but one marked by concern. As he entered the house, Jack was met with a desolate scene. Charles, frail and tired, seemed to have lost the vigor that once characterized him. The house, though full of memories, was engulfed in an oppressive melancholy. Jack felt a tightness in his chest as he saw the state his friend was in. The neglect was not only apparent in the house but in Charles himself, who struggled to stay on his feet, as if each movement required superhuman effort. Jack knew he couldn't leave him like that. Driven by duty and friendship, Jack acted immediately. He hired a nurse to care for Charles, cleaned the house, and arranged for everything his friend needed to live with a minimum of dignity. But that wasn't the only thing bothering him. Jack sensed there was something else buried under the weight of the years. Something Charles wasn't telling, maybe out of pride, maybe out of forgetfulness. As they organized Charles's documents, Jack found a forgotten letter, tucked away in a drawer that, by the looks of it, hadn't been opened in decades. It was a letter from an old friend of Charles, someone Jack didn't recognize by name. The handwriting on the letter was firm, but with a slight tremor, as if the person writing it was dealing with their own ghosts. Charles looked at the letter for a long moment before speaking. He knew what it was about, but he had buried it deep in his mind, believing it no longer had any relevance. Jack, curious, insisted they open it together. The contents of the letter took them both by surprise. In it, Charles's friend revealed that he had left a substantial inheritance for him: stocks, bonds, properties, all carefully accumulated over a lifetime of investments. Charles's first reaction was disbelief. It didn't seem real, as if it belonged to another time, another world. But as the reality sank in, the magnitude of the discovery began to weigh on him. It wasn't just money, it was an opportunity, a chance to do something bigger with the time he had left. Jack, realizing this, looked at Charles with a new perspective. He had always known Charles to be a man of principles, but now he saw his friend about to face a decision that could change the course of his remaining years. Jack knew that there was more at stake than just finances. Charles had a complicated relationship with money, and the emotional wounds caused by Stephen's distance were still open. The inheritance could be a bridge to reconcile father and son, or it could become another source of conflict. In the days that followed, Charles, with Jack's help, began to study the details of the inheritance. It was a considerable sum, enough to change lives. But the question Charles couldn't answer was, how would this affect his own life? And, more importantly, how would it affect his relationship with Stephen? Would his son, who had left him so many years ago, return seeking genuine reconciliation, or only for financial gain? Charles felt the weight of these questions every night as he looked at the faded portrait of Stephen on the wall. Jack, by his side, offered support. but he knew this was a journey Charles would have to face alone. Time was running out, and the decisions Charles would make in the coming weeks would determine not only his legacy, but the possibility of healing a relationship marked by silence and distance. The future of Charles, Jack, and Stephen was now irrevocably intertwined, and each move seemed loaded with implications far greater than what money could suggest. The impact of the letter rippled through Charles's life like a silent wave. Each day since the discovery brought more questions than answers. Jack, despite being a constant and comforting presence, knew there were limits to what he could do. The true burden rested on Charles's shoulders. And then, an inevitable decision was made. Stephen had to be informed about the inheritance. Stephen Redding. The name brought painful memories and regret for Charles. Years ago, Stephen had been the center of his world, the only son in whom he had placed so many hopes. But Stephen's once promising career had turned into a path of estrangement, and the relationship between father and son eroded over time, distance, and ambitions that seemed larger than any family bond. Stephen moved across the country, seeking success at a prestigious law firm. As the years of work piled up, his visits became rarer, until, at some point, they stopped altogether. It was strange how time could turn people who once knew each other so well into almost strangers. Charles, now sitting in his worn armchair, staring at the phone, knew that calling Stephen would bring up much more than just the issue of the inheritance. It would force both of them to confront everything that had been ignored for so long. The news was brief, practical. Charles kept a neutral tone as he explained the inheritance he had received, and that Stephen's presence would be required for the legal process. On the other end of the line, Stephen's silence revealed more than any words could. There was no explosion of emotion, no hurried questions about the amount, just a distant, formal agreement. Stephen would come, but what he was truly seeking remained a mystery. When Stephen finally arrived in town, Charles barely recognized him. He looked different, not just physically, but in a deeper way. Dressed in a flawless suit, with controlled gestures and an expression that revealed nothing, Stephen seemed to embody the successful lawyer he had always aspired to be. But his eyes carried a coldness that Charles hadn't expected to see in his own son. The first meeting between father and son was brief, almost painfully superficial. There was an elephant in the room, and both were aware of it, but neither seemed willing to address it directly. The formalities of the inheritance, it seemed, would serve as a shield to protect both from the confrontation that truly mattered. Jack, watching everything from a distance, remained cautious. There was something about Stephen that deeply unsettled him. He knew that Charles's intentions in calling his son went beyond money, but Stephen's behavior indicated that reconciliation wouldn't be simple. Maybe it wouldn't even be possible. Jack began to observe Stephen with suspicion, trying to decipher whether his interest was driven by a desire to reconnect with his father or simply by the financial value now at stake. In the days that followed, Stephen began to visit Charles's house more frequently. With each visit, he became more involved with the legal processes, always asking about the technical details of the inheritance, the properties, and the investments. The way Stephen handled it was impersonal, as if he were dealing with a client's estate and not his own father's. But Charles, though hurt by Stephen's coldness, remained patient. There was something in him that longed for more. He hoped that, at some point, his son would lower his guard and they could finally talk, not as lawyer and beneficiary, but as father and son. One evening, as they were organizing more documents in Charles's office, Stephen paused for a moment, staring at an old photograph on one of the shelves. It was a family photo, taken when he was still a child. His mother, who had passed away many years ago, smiled lovingly. Charles's face was lit up with an expression of pride and happiness he had long forgotten. Stephen looked at the image longer than usual, as if trying to remember something that had long been lost. "Do you remember that day?" Charles asked, breaking the silence, his voice rough and hesitant. Stephen, without taking his eyes off the photo, nodded slightly but didn't respond. There was an internal battle happening within him, something Charles couldn't decipher. It was a small sign, but enough to keep alive the hope that something deeper still remained. The inheritance process moved forward, but with it came difficult decisions. Jack, noticing that Stephen was becoming more and more immersed in the numbers and legal aspects, suggested that Charles place some conditions on full access to the inheritance. "It's not about the money, Charles," Jack said in a firm tone. "This is about ensuring that what you built over a lifetime doesn't get lost, that the real value of this money goes beyond figures in a bank account." Charles, already worn out by recent events, began to seriously consider the idea. The matter of the inheritance now transcended the simple act of transferring money or property. It was an opportunity to create something that would carry on the legacy of his life, something bigger than any monetary sum. And with that, Charles began to draft a plan that would change everything. On a quiet afternoon, while Stephen was in town handling more legal matters, Charles met with Jack and a trusted lawyer. He laid out his ideas. A significant portion of the inheritance would be dedicated to creating a foundation for abandoned elderly, just as he had felt for so many years. The money would be used to ensure that no one else would suffer the loneliness and neglect he had endured. The proposal brought a gleam of satisfaction to Charles's eyes, something he hadn't felt in a long time. However, there was still the matter of Stephen. How would he react? Charles knew that his son's reaction would be a decisive test of who he had truly become. Charles felt a new phase approaching, but it wasn't a feeling of renewal or hope. It was the weight of uncertainty. After deciding the fate of the inheritance, he knew there was no turning back. The creation of the foundation for the elderly would be an immortal legacy, a way to ensure that his suffering wasn't in vain. But what truly consumed him was the thought of how Stephen would react to this decision. Despite the emotional distance between them, Charles still held on to the hope of reconciliation, even if it was just a sliver of hope. That night, as Charles and Jack reviewed the final details with the lawyer, Stephen arrived earlier than expected. His entrance was quiet, but he sensed something different in the room. Upon seeing the papers on the table, his legal instincts kicked in immediately. He approached slowly, his eyes fixed on what appeared to be legal documents. "Can I know what's going on?" Stephen asked, his tone controlled but with a hint of suspicion. Charles, already prepared for the inevitable confrontation, gestured for Stephen to sit. Jack remained silent, watching the movements of both men carefully, as if witnessing a silent battle about to erupt. "Stephen," Charles began, his voice weaker than he expected, "I've made some decisions regarding the inheritance. I want you to know I didn't do this impulsively. There's something bigger than just material possessions at play here." Stephen kept his eyes fixed on his father, saying nothing, but Charles could feel the tension building between them. He continued, trying not to falter. "I'm allocating a significant portion of the inheritance to a foundation. I want to ensure that elderly people, like me, who go through years of isolation and neglect, receive support, that they aren't left to fend for themselves, like I was." The last sentence slipped out unintentionally, but the weight of the words echoed in the room. Stephen, who had maintained an almost indifferent posture, finally showed a reaction. His eyes blinked quickly, and he shook his head as if trying to reorganize his thoughts. It was clear that Charles's decision had taken him by surprise. "A foundation?" Stephen asked, his voice low but loaded with restrained disbelief. "You're saying you're going to give away most of the inheritance? Is that it?" "It's not a donation. It's a legacy, Stephen," Charles corrected, trying to remain calm. "This is to ensure that other people don't suffer what I've suffered. It's not just about money." Stephen was silent for a few moments, processing the information. His eyes fell on the papers on the table, the pen beside them, the legal details nearly all settled. He knew that with this, the fate of a large part of the fortune was already sealed. And for the first time, Stephen couldn't entirely hide his frustration. "I understand what you're trying to do," Stephen began, crossing his arms, "but that doesn't change the fact that I'm your son. What are you leaving for me then? Some stocks, a few minor properties? I'm your only son, Dad, and I should have a say in this decision." The room sank into an uncomfortable silence. Jack pressed his lips together, trying to control the urge to intervene. But Charles, though fragile, stood firm. "You're right, Stephen. You are my son, and that's exactly why I'm doing this." Charles stood up with difficulty, leaning on his cane and walked toward the window, his back to his son. He continued without looking at Stephen, as if the words were too difficult to say directly. I've spent years wondering where I went wrong, if it was me who pushed you away, or if you left on your own. But now, with the time I have left, I realize that what matters most isn't money. It's not material things. What matters is what you do with the life you're given. And Stephen, what have you done with yours? The impact of those words was like a blow Stephen didn't expect. Charles wasn't just questioning financial decisions, but Stephen's entire life. The question hung in the air, without an immediate answer. Jack watched everything in silence, his loyalty to Charles unwavering, but aware that this was a moment only father and son could resolve. Stephen, for his part, felt his anger rising, but it wasn't just because of the inheritance. It was because, suddenly, the situation forced him to face questions he had buried deep inside. The emptiness he had filled with work, success, and prestige now seemed superficial, fragile in the light of his father's confrontation. "I worked hard, Dad," Stephen said, his voice now carrying a slight tremor. "Yes, I distanced myself, but it was for something. I achieved everything you always wanted for me. A solid career, a life of respect. I did what I thought was right." "You got what you wanted," Charles replied, still with his back to Stephen, looking at the horizon beyond the window. "But you lost yourself along the way." The words were simple, but they carried decades of unspoken hurt. Stephen, for the first time in years, felt a lump in his throat that he couldn't swallow. Everything he had achieved now seemed insignificant in the face of the raw truth his father was revealing. He wasn't just dealing with the loss of material inheritance. He was confronting the failure of a relationship he had always taken for granted. Stephen abruptly stood up, his fists clenched, but he didn't say anything. He was about to leave, but before passing through the door, something made him stop. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the inheritance. It was something he couldn't yet name, but somehow it kept him from walking away. "Why now, Dad?" Stephen asked, his voice lower, softer. "Why decide this now? Why try to fix something that's already broken?" Charles sighed, feeling the weight of his age in his bones and in his heart. He knew there were no easy answers. He turned slowly, his tired eyes meeting Stephen's with a sincerity that had been postponed for too long. "Because there's still time, Stephen. Maybe not for me, but for you. I don't want you to follow the same path I did. Life is more than titles and bank accounts. If I've learned anything in these years of loneliness, it's that what matters most are the people around us. And son, you've distanced yourself from everyone. There's still time to change." Stephen remained silent. There were no more arguments, no more defenses, just the silence between father and son, as dense as the years of distance that separated them. Deep down, he knew his father's truth was inescapable, but accepting it was an internal battle he didn't yet know how to win. Without saying another word, Stephen left the house. The sound of the door closing echoed through the empty room, leaving Charles and Jack alone. Jack, who had witnessed everything in silence, approached his friend, placing a hand on his shoulder. Charles, his eyes moist, just shook his head. "Time will tell if he understands, Jack. Time will tell." The silence in Charles's house after Stephen left was palpable, as if all the walls had absorbed the unspoken words, the open wounds, and the accumulated resentments from decades past. Jack remained by Charles's side, but he knew that, in that moment, his old friend was fighting an internal battle that no one could help him win. It was a struggle between a father's love and the choices of a life that, somehow, had been lost between them. The days that followed were marked by an eerie quiet. Stephen didn't return, and Charles, though he anxiously hoped for a sign from his son, knew that reconciliation wouldn't come quickly. Perhaps it wasn't even possible. The reality was harsh, but he was prepared to face it. And while he waited, the wheels for creating the foundation for the elderly began to turn. Jack, with the pragmatic energy that had always characterized him, threw himself into the work. He was a man of action, and he knew that Charles needed to see results, needed to feel that the project was not just an idea but a tangible reality. They met with lawyers, architects, and financial consultants. Jack, with his military leadership experience, took on the role of coordinating the operations, ensuring that every detail was carefully analyzed and implemented. But even with visible progress, something was troubling Charles. It wasn't just Stephen's absence, but the shadow of something deeper. something he hadn't even revealed to Jack. The memories he had been trying to bury for so long began to resurface as he organized his final days and his legacy. One afternoon, while sifting through old family documents and papers, Charles found an old letter, aged by time, hidden among other papers. It was a letter he hadn't seen in many years, and at the time he had chosen to forget it. With trembling hands, he opened it. The feminine handwriting, fluid and elegant, was unmistakable. His wife, Margaret, had written that letter. Charles felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Margaret had passed away many years ago, and he had done everything he could to keep her memory alive. But over time, he had distanced himself from the emotional content of the loss. Now this letter, which had never been sent, brought back all the repressed emotions. Margaret had written to Stephen, but never had the courage to deliver it. It was a letter written in the final months of her life, when she was already gravely ill, knowing her time was running out. She had written it with the hope of healing the wounds that had begun to form between father and son. Charles had never read it until now, and its contents were like a late revelation. A piece he hadn't known was missing from his life. My dear Stephen, I know these words may never reach you, and it may be too late, but I want you to know that, despite all our failings as parents, we love you more than anything in this world. I know your life now is far from ours, and the dreams you pursue seem bigger than the ones your father and I had planned for you. But there's one thing I hope you never forget. What matters most in the end is not success or recognition. It's love. The love you have for those around you, for your family. Your father, Stephen, is a man of few words, and I know he has trouble showing how much he cares. But he loves you, even if he can't say it. Even if he seems hard, he misses you every day. And so do I. I hope one day you'll find your way back to him. He needs you now more than ever. Margaret's words cut through Charles like a cold blade. Everything he had tried to suppress for so long, all the unresolved pain, surfaced with unexpected intensity. He realized in that moment that Stephen's distance hadn't just begun with his career or professional choices. There was something deeper, an emotional distance that he, as a father, had failed to break. Sitting in that room that now felt emptier than ever, Charles cried. He cried for Margaret, for Stephen, but most of all for himself, for all the missed opportunities to be the father he should have been. Jack entered the room silently, noticing Charles's state. Without a word, he sat next to his friend, respecting that moment of fragility, something rare for a man like Charles. "Jack, I messed up," Charles said, his voice barely audible. "I messed up with Stephen from the start. It wasn't just him who distanced himself. I did too. I always thought I was doing my best, but the truth is, I didn't know how to be the father he needed." Jack listened in silence, knowing there were no words to fill that void. He knew that Charles had been carrying this weight for a long time, but he also knew that what was happening now was a necessary step toward his friend's redemption. The truth was being confronted, and as painful as it was the only possible path. The next day, Charles made a decision. He needed to face Stephen once more, but this time, it wouldn't be about the inheritance, the money, or the legacy. It would be about something bigger, something Margaret had already understood years before her death. The love he, even without knowing how to show it, had always had for his son. Meanwhile, Stephen, in his distant professional life, was caught in a whirlwind of thoughts. The conversation with his father, the silent confrontations, and the harsh words still echoed in his mind. He tried to focus on work, but something inside him kept pulling him back. Back to that house, back to the father he thought he knew, but who now seemed like someone completely different. Amid the paperwork and clients, Stephen found himself thinking about the foundation his father had decided to create. At first, he had seen it as an affront, a way for his father to deny him the inheritance he believed was rightfully his. But as the days passed, he began to realize something he had never considered before. The foundation was Charles's desperate attempt to do something good, to leave something meaningful for the world, perhaps to make up for the emptiness he felt inside. But could it also be, in some way, a plea for forgiveness? These thoughts, vague and conflicting, began to weigh on Stephen's conscience. He was used to solving complex problems in court, handling arguments and strategies, But what was unfolding in his mind now was something he didn't know how to deal with. Could it be that, after so many years, he was ready to forgive? And more importantly, could it be that he, too, needed forgiveness? These questions tormented him, and for the first time in a long while, Stephen found himself at a crossroads he couldn't resolve with logic or arguments. He needed to return to that house, but not for the money or the assets. Something else was calling him back, something he couldn't yet name, but that grew inside him with each passing day. Stephen knew time was running out. Stephen's return to his father's house wasn't planned or deliberate. That morning, he woke up with an unease he couldn't name. The work that once consumed him now felt purposeless, and the decisions he made daily seemed irrelevant compared to what was happening in his mind. It was as if, after years of dedicating himself to his career, he finally realized the emptiness it had left in his personal life. And that emptiness had a name: Charles. As he drove to his father's house, Stephen mentally rehearsed what he would say. He tried to structure his words as he would in a courtroom, with logic and precision, but he knew that there, in front of his father, no technical argument would matter. He wasn't going to win a dispute. He was going to face something far more difficult: the man he had become and the man his father had been. Perhaps in some way, he was trying to understand how their two paths had intertwined and, more importantly, how they had diverged. When Stephen arrived at the house, he noticed the uncomfortable familiarity. Everything looked as he remembered, but there was something different in the air. A sense of urgency, perhaps. He parked the car and sat for a few minutes, staring at the door, unsure if he should really go in. Part of him wanted to turn back, leave everything as it was, and continue with his life. But another part, quiet yet stronger, urged him to go on. When he finally decided to enter, he was greeted by Jack, who watched him with a serious, though not hostile, expression. Jack had always been a man of few words, and this moment was no exception. He merely gave a slight nod, as if to acknowledge the importance of this visit. He knew that Stephen wasn't there for any practical reason. It was deeper, more painful. "He's in the office," Jack said, breaking the silence before leaving the room, leaving Stephen alone with his thoughts. Stephen walked slowly through the house, feeling the memories envelop him. The old photos on the walls, the muffled sound of the wooden floor beneath his feet. Every detail of that house carried a part of his childhood, a part he had left behind, but that now seemed to resurface with unexpected force. When he entered the office, he found Charles sitting at the desk, his eyes fixed on an old letter he was holding delicately. It was Margaret's letter. The silence in the room was almost tangible. Charles didn't look up immediately, as if he knew this moment would come but didn't want to rush it. Stephen approached slowly, each step echoing the weight of what was to come. When he finally stopped in front of his father, time seemed to slow, as if they were both trapped in a moment they knew would never be repeated. Charles finally looked up, and in his father's eyes, Stephen saw something he wasn't prepared for: fragility. But it wasn't just physical. There was an emotional vulnerability he had never associated with his father before. For a few moments, neither said a word. Words seemed unnecessary, at least for a brief moment. Then, with a heavy sigh, Charles finally broke the silence. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse but unsurprised. "I knew eventually you would come." Stephen stood there looking at his father, unsure how to begin. There was no script for this kind of encounter. After a few seconds, he sat in the chair in front of the desk, but still couldn't say anything. It was as if all the words he had rehearsed on the way there had disappeared, leaving only the raw reality of two men trying to figure out what to do with years of silence. "Dad," Stephen began, his voice hesitant but sincere. I don't know how to start this." Charles looked at his son with a mixture of sadness and understanding. He had waited for this moment for years, but now that it was happening, he realized he didn't know how to handle it either. After all, there was no formula for healing wounds like these. "Maybe there isn't an easy start," Charles replied, "but what matters is that you're here." Stephen's eyes shifted to the floor. He couldn't look his father in the eye. The guilt and regret weighed on him, heavier than he had imagined. For years, he had built a life around professional success, titles, and achievements, but now, standing before the man who raised him, all of it seemed insignificant. "I was wrong," Stephen finally said, almost as a confession. "I distanced myself. I thought I was doing the right thing, chasing something bigger, but I lost my way. I distanced myself from you, from our family, and I didn't realize until now how much it's cost me." Charles watched his son, his eyes shining with painful understanding. He knew he was partly to blame, but hearing Stephen acknowledge his own mistakes was a step he had never expected to see. "It wasn't just you," Charles said, his voice softer now. "I made mistakes too, many mistakes. I didn't know how to be the father you needed. My own fears and the rigidity I always held on to blinded me to what really mattered. And by the time I realized it, it was too late. I thought if you were successful, that would be enough, but it never was it?" Stephen shook his head, feeling his father's words strike deep within his soul. The truth was painful, but inescapable. He realized that both of them had lived for years with the same sense of failure, but neither had known how to fix it. "I thought success would bring me peace," Stephen continued. "But looking back, I see something was always missing. Something I never wanted to admit. You. All I could think about was proving myself, showing that I could do it on my own. But I didn't need to do it alone. I needed you, even when I thought I didn't." Stephen's words, filled with emotion, caused Charles to lean forward slightly. The old man, who had lived in silence for so many years, now found himself facing his son's confession, something he had never believed possible. There was pain in Stephen's words, but there was also hope. Hope that, even after all this time, there was still something worth saving. "Margaret always believed you'd come back," Charles said with a soft, nostalgic tone. "She wrote this letter for you, but never had the courage to send it. Maybe she knew time would resolve things, one way or another." He handed the letter to Stephen, who held it carefully. As he began to read, he felt the tears burn in his eyes. His mother's words, so full of love and wisdom, hit him like a truth he had forgotten. He realized that, even in death, Margaret was still trying to heal the relationship between father and son. When he finished, Stephen couldn't hold back the tears. He wasn't the type of man who allowed himself to be vulnerable, but there, in that moment, there were no more defenses or walls. He was just a son, back in his father's house, trying to recover the lost time. Charles, seeing his son's state, stood up with difficulty and with slow steps walked over to him. He placed his hand on Stephen's shoulder, and for the first time in many years, the two embraced. It wasn't a hug of victory or complete reconciliation, but one of recognition. A recognition that, despite all the failures and distance, love was still there, even if buried under layers of silence and pain. As they embraced, Charles whispered something in Stephen's ear, something he had never said before but had always deeply felt. "I love you, my son. I always have." And in that instant, in the fragile and sincere embrace between father and son, something changed. The weight of the past was still there, but now it was shared between the two of them. There wouldn't be an immediate solution or a miraculous healing, but there was the promise that with the time they had left, they could rebuild what they had once lost. And as the sun set on the horizon, bathing the house in a soft, golden light, father and son stood there together, letting the silence say what words no longer needed to. In the days that followed, the relationship between Charles and Stephen took on a slow but meaningful pace. Both knew that the emotional distance built over so many years wouldn't disappear overnight, but the first step had been taken. The weight of the resentment, though still present, began to give way to a sense of possibility. There was still time to start anew, and for Charles, that hope was enough for the days he had left. Stephen, on his part, began visiting his father more often. At first, the visits were short and quiet, but they soon filled with conversations about the past, moments both had lived, but until now had never shared with true understanding. Charles, with his late-found wisdom, began to reveal to his son stories of his youth, how he met Margaret, and how the choices they made as a couple influenced Stephen's upbringing. The conversations were tinged with nostalgia, but also with regret. In one of those conversations, Stephen, sitting on the old couch in the living room, asked something he had long wanted to understand. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me how you really felt? All these years it seemed like you were so distant, like you didn't want to let me in." Charles sighed, knowing that question was inevitable. He looked up, observing his son's face, now that of a grown man, and with silent regret, he responded, "I thought I was protecting you, Stephen, protecting you from what I thought was my weakness. I always saw myself as a strong man, someone who needed to show control. And when you grew up and went your own way, well, I thought I was doing the right thing by letting you be who you wanted to be. I never knew how to balance the love I had for you with the pride I felt. Silence seemed safer." Stephen remained quiet for a few seconds, processing his father's words. He had always believed Charles's distance was intentional, a kind of indifference. He had never considered that. In fact, it might have been a misunderstood act of protection. "You didn't need to be strong all the time, Dad," Stephen finally said, his voice softer. "I needed you, even when I didn't know it. And I think for a long time, you needed me too." Charles nodded slowly, the regret visible on his face. He knew there was no way to recover lost time, but he was determined to make the most of what remained. As the relationship between father and son slowly rebuilt, the foundation Charles had planned was taking shape. Jack, with his organizational skills, was leading most of the practical aspects. He worked tirelessly, hiring experts, forming partnerships with charitable institutions, and bringing in doctors who offered care for the elderly. The foundation, which Charles decided to call the Margaret Redding Foundation, in honor of the wife who had never stopped being his moral compass, was beginning to become a reality. The foundation's mission wasn't just to provide medical care for the elderly, but also to create a space where those emotionally abandoned could find companionship and support. The goal was clear: to prevent others from enduring the same years of loneliness that Charles had faced. As the project advanced, Charles felt that he was finally turning his pain into something that could bring comfort and dignity to others. At one point, Jack suggested that Stephen become more directly involved with the foundation. Though his relationship with Charles was in the process of rebuilding, there was still a noticeable tension between Stephen and Jack. Jack had always harbored doubts about Stephen's intentions, fearing that Charles's son was more concerned with the inheritance than with a genuine reconciliation. However, Charles, always perceptive, believed it was the right time to extend his son a vote of confidence. "Stephen," Charles said one morning as they sat at the dining table, "I'd like you to take on part of the foundation. I know you have a life out there with your job and commitments, but this means a lot to me, and I believe it could mean a lot to you too." Stephen looked at his father, surprised by the proposal. From the start, he had distanced himself from the idea of getting involved with the foundation, perhaps seeing it as a symbol of Charles's decision to move away from financial expectations. But now, over time, he was beginning to see it from a different perspective. "Do you think I could help?" Stephen asked, doubt still present in his voice. Charles smiled faintly, seeing in that question an opening for something new. "You're my son, and despite the years of distance, I believe you have your mother's heart. The foundation, it's part of our legacy, something I want you to help build." Stephen sat in silence for a few seconds, reflecting. Throughout his career, he had built a life based on success, on achievements that brought respect and financial stability, but lately he had started to recognize the emptiness it left behind. The foundation offered an opportunity to do something different, something that transcended the values he had grown up with. I'll think about it, Dad," Stephen finally said, trying to process the proposal. There was a part of him that still resisted, but a deeper part was beginning to feel that this could be a path to redemption for both him and his father. As the days turned into weeks, Stephen began spending more time involved in the foundation's activities. Initially, his role was practical, reviewing contracts, handling legal issues, and organizing the paperwork, tasks at which he was always competent. But gradually, Stephen began to see the faces of the elderly the foundation aimed to help. He started to realize that behind every contract and document, there was a story. Stories like his father's, stories of people like Charles, who had been forgotten by time and society. One afternoon, while walking through the grounds where the foundation's building would be constructed, Stephen encountered Jack. The two, who had maintained a distant and somewhat distrustful relationship, knew they needed to address the tension between them. I know you've always had your doubts about me, Stephen said bluntly, while looking out at the horizon. And I can't blame you for that. The truth is, for a long time, I doubted myself too. Jack, ever pragmatic, remained silent for a moment, evaluating the man before him. He knew Stephen was speaking sincerely, and while he had his reservations, he also knew when to recognize someone trying to change. I just wanted to make sure Charles wouldn't get hurt again, Jack finally replied. He's been through a lot, and I see him as a brother. I just want this foundation to be something that honors Margaret's memory and brings peace to him. Stephen nodded, understanding Jack's concern. He was beginning to realize that more than any material inheritance, his father's true legacy would be what they built together. I understand that now, Stephen said, and I want to be part of it, not just for him, but for me too. I think it's the only way to fix what I've left behind. Jack looked at Stephen for a moment, considering his words, before finally giving a slight nod of approval. Then we're on the same side now, Jack said, extending his hand. Let's do this right. Stephen shook Jack's hand, a simple gesture but one filled with meaning. From that moment on, they were not just allies in the Foundation, but also in the journey of redemption that they both knew would be long and difficult. As the Foundation project progressed, Charles watched everything with quiet satisfaction. He knew his time was running out, but he also knew he was leaving behind something bigger than any fortune. He was leaving behind a legacy of care, of love, and above all, of reconciliation. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Weeks passed, and the Margaret Redding Foundation began to take physical shape. The once empty lot was now home to structures that would one day house elderly individuals, offering not only medical care but also a community of support and dignity. For Charles, seeing the foundation come to life was the culmination of a personal journey of transformation. After years of battling loneliness and regrets, he now saw his dream materialize, almost like a final tribute to the life he had shared with Margaret. Stephen, on the other hand, began to find his place within the project. Initially, his involvement was practical, dealing with the bureaucratic and legal aspects. However, he gradually became more engaged with the people involved in the foundation, especially the elderly who would benefit from it. Little by little, his work extended beyond simple contracts and legal terms. He started listening to the stories of the future residents, and in them, he saw reflections of what his own father had endured: the isolation, the feeling of being forgotten by the world. Each conversation with these elderly individuals was both a painful and liberating reminder of how different Charles's life could have been if he had received this kind of support years earlier. Now, the foundation they were building together offered Stephen a unique opportunity for redemption, not only with his father, but also within his own conscience. On one of these visits, Stephen met Alice, an 82-year-old woman who had been a history teacher. She was one of the first on the list of future residents. Sitting in a rocking chair in a corner of the room, Alice had a sparkle in her eyes that contrasted with her frail appearance. Her gray hair was neatly combed, and her wrinkled, delicate hands rested on an old book. "Alice, right?" Stephen asked as he approached. She looked at him with a warm smile. "Yes, and you must be Charles's son." Stephen nodded, surprised by the welcoming tone of the elderly woman. He pulled up a chair and sat beside her, noticing the book she was holding. It was a well-worn history volume. "You were a teacher, right?" Stephen asked, trying to start a conversation. "Yes, for many years. I taught generations of children. Now, well, there aren't many students anymore, but I still love telling stories. And from what I hear, it seems your foundation is about to give many new stories to people like me." Stephen smiled, but his face quickly took on a more serious expression. He knew that many of these people, like Alice, had spent years unnoticed, their lives slowly fading into obscurity. The foundation, he was beginning to realize, wasn't just a project to help the elderly live with dignity. It was also a way to give value to lives that had been neglected for so long. "That's why we're here," Stephen said, his voice filled with sincerity, "to make sure no one feels forgotten anymore." Alice leaned slightly forward in her chair, looking into Stephen's eyes with a wisdom that only time could offer. "We all make mistakes, young man. Some of us drift away from the people we love, others get lost in their own ambitions. But there's always time to make amends, whether with others or with yourself. What you're doing here, helping your father, that's a form of forgiveness. Those words hit Stephen hard. He had spent so much time carrying the weight of his own guilt, trying to balance his ambitions with the failures of his past, that he hadn't realized how much his involvement with the foundation was transforming him. When he stood to leave, Alice gently held his arm. "When everything's ready, come visit me at the foundation. I want to see the result of your work. And who knows, maybe I can share some real stories with you." Stephen smiled, touched by the woman's kindness. He nodded, promising that he would return. Later that afternoon, Stephen found Charles in the home office. His father was sitting in a leather chair, surrounded by papers and plans for the foundation, but he looked tired. Age was catching up fast, and as Stephen watched his father more closely, he began to see just how fragile Charles really was. "Dad," Stephen said, sitting down at the table, "I've been thinking about the foundation and what it means to you." Charles looked at his son, his eyes clear but weary. There was something different about Stephen, something he hadn't seen in years, a softness in his expression, as if he had finally stopped fighting the idea of being vulnerable. "I know I haven't been as present as I should have been, and I've failed in many ways," Stephen continued, carefully choosing his words. "But I want you to know that now I understand what you're trying to do here, and I want to be part of it, not because it's a way to fix the past, but because I believe in some way it's helping me find a new path too." Charles stayed silent for a moment, Stephen's words resonating in his heart. He had always known that deep down, his son carried a kindness that had often been overshadowed by his ambitions. Now, standing before him, was the man he had always hoped to see. Not the successful lawyer, but the son Margaret had always believed Stephen could be. "I'm glad to hear that, Stephen," Charles said, with a gentle smile. "Your mother always knew you'd come back." When he mentioned Margaret, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Stephen felt a pang of emotion he hadn't expected, and Charles, with a voice thick with emotion, continued. "You know, Stephen, it wasn't easy living through these years alone. When your mother passed, I lost more than a wife. I lost my compass, and I think, in a way, I lost you too. But now, I see that there's still time to fix things." Stephen looked at his father, feeling the weight of his words. He knew Charles was nearing the end of his life, but for the first time he felt that the time left could be well spent. The past couldn't be changed, but the present could. "I'm going to do this right, Dad," Stephen said, his voice firm. "We'll make this foundation grow and honor everything you and Mom stood for." Charles nodded, satisfied. It was all he had ever wanted to hear, but he knew that more than promises, the real test would come with time. As the foundation neared its grand opening, Charles and Stephen began working side by side. Stephen threw himself into the project, fully committed, becoming more connected to the idea that the foundation wasn't just his father's legacy, but also a chance for his own redemption. The time they spent together didn't erase the decades of distance, but it began to build something new. Conversations, once tense and filled with resentment, now flowed more easily. The healing process was underway, and slowly, father and son were growing closer again, rebuilding the trust and love they had lost over the years. Charles, now 98, felt the weight of his age. Each day was another battle against fatigue, but he remained determined to live long enough to see the foundation open. That goal seemed to give him strength, as if the project itself were keeping him alive. And with Stephen by his side, he finally felt that he could leave in peace, knowing that his legacy was secure. Not just in the foundation he had built, but in the man his son was becoming.
So, if you're not subscribed yet, click on the subscribe button below and join our community. Thank you for your support and see you in the next videos.